The drive was the reason I bought the house in the first place. A wide, clean stretch of concrete that curved from the street up to my garage like a private runway, built solid decades ago and framed by tidy grass that caught the sunlight every morning. And for 5 peaceful years it never meant anything more than convenience. The simple comfort of backing my truck out without scraping tires on a curb. The predictable routine of rolling trash bins down the slope and waving at passing neighbors. The kind of normal life you don't appreciate until someone decides your normal life is a violation. And the day it began was bright and sharp, the sky a flawless blue, the air warm enough to feel like the season had finally turned. And I was halfway through rinsing pollen off my windshield when a man in a pressed polo stepped onto my driveway without introducing himself, holding a clipboard and a folder so thick it looked like a weapon disguised as paperwork, and he didn't ask if I had a minute. Didn't start with a greeting, just planted his feet as if he owned the concrete under them and announced that the Homeowner Association had determined my drive was non-compliant infrastructure, that it would need to be demolished and replaced with an approved design at my expense, and that I had 14 days to submit a plan or face escalating fines, liens, and corrective action. A phrase that landed like a threat because it wasn't just about a slab of concrete, it was about access control. And the assumption that I would obey before I even understood what he was claiming. And when I asked what exactly was wrong with my drive, he tapped the folder and said the association had discovered a conflict with an infrastructure plan, that my drive encroached into a protected corridor, that the community had future projects scheduled, and that my property's existing layout was now in the way. As if the last 30 years of the drive existing without issue were irrelevant because someone on a board had decided to redraw the world on a map. And what made my stomach tighten wasn't just the demand, it was the certainty. The way he spoke like the demolition was already decided, like my options were limited to compliance or punishment. And I could feel the neighborhood watching even before I turned my head because the association never arrives quietly. It arrives with visibility, with performance. Hoping you'll feel embarrassed enough to cooperate, and sure enough a couple of male neighbors slowed at the sidewalk, pretending to check their phones, listening without admitting they were listening, and the man with the clipboard noticed them too and raised his voice just slightly, making sure his words carried, using phrases like community standards and protecting investments, turning my driveway into a public lesson about what happens when someone doesn't fall in line. And I kept my voice calm because outrage is what these confrontations feed on, so I asked for the specific rule he was citing, the specific plan, the specific measurement, and he gave me none of it, only a printed notice with official-looking formatting that said demand for removal. Unapproved driveway construction, as if it had appeared last week instead of existing long before I ever owned the place. And I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because the logic was so warped it almost felt unreal, and that laugh hardened his tone immediately, warning me that refusal to comply would be documented as willful, that the board would not debate settled matters, and that the association's enforcement team would return to photograph the area for the record. Then he handed me the notice like a summons and walked away as if the conversation was finished, leaving me standing in bright sunlight with a demolition order in my hand, and the first real sense that my quiet life had just been targeted by people who didn't care what was true, only what they could enforce. And after he left, I stood on the driveway and looked at it with fresh eyes, at the clean edges, the smooth surface, the way it connected my home to the street in the most ordinary, necessary way. And I tried to imagine a crew showing up with saws and jackhammers because a board wanted my property to match a drawing, and the idea made anger rise in my chest like heat. But underneath that anger was something more useful, a suspicion, because I knew my home wasn't new, and I knew the drive wasn't something I had poured after moving in. It was listed in the purchase documents. It was part of the property's established layout. And the association had approved my closing without any mention of demolition, which meant this wasn't about compliance discovered by chance, it was about an agenda. And as I walked inside and set the notice on my kitchen table, I noticed the language again, that phrase he'd used twice like a magic spell, infrastructure plan, and something about it rang wrong because associations love to throw around terms that sound official, but real infrastructure planning usually involves city departments. Permits, engineers, public records, and timelines that don't bend to a board meeting mood. So I pulled out the folder where I kept my house documents, the boring stack everyone forgets until their home is threatened, and I started flipping through closing paperwork, plats, surveys, and old disclosures, searching for anything about a corridor or planned project. And while the sun moved across the room and lit dust in the air, I found a page I barely remembered. A recorded site map stamped years ago showing utility and drainage features, lines and notations that had seemed meaningless at the time because everything worked and nothing was contested. And what I saw on that map made me pause because there was a marked strip near the edge of my lot, a designated right-of-way zone tied to a municipal drainage project, not an HOA project, something older and bigger than the association, and there was a notation about an approved surface crossing. A small detail that suggested the driveway wasn't an encroachment at all, but a permitted solution. And the more I read, the more the situation clarified into something uglier than a simple misunderstanding. Someone on the board had discovered a future municipal improvement concept, misunderstood it or twisted it, and decided my drive was the leverage point to force changes they wanted, whether for aesthetics, control, or to set precedent, and suddenly the clipboard visit felt less like enforcement and more like an opening strike, a move designed to make me panic and start spending money or surrendering ground before I had time to verify anything. And as that realization settled, my phone buzzed with an email from the association marked urgent, repeating the demolition demand in even harsher terms, including a bullet list of penalties and a reminder that association decisions are final. And reading that line in the bright calm of my own kitchen, I understood the real conflict wasn't the concrete. It was the assumption behind it, the assumption that I would accept their version of reality because it arrived printed, stamped, and delivered with confidence. And in that moment, with sunlight pouring across the same driveway they wanted me to destroy, I made a quiet decision that shaped everything that followed. I wasn't going to argue with them in circles, I wasn't going to plead for mercy, and I definitely wasn't going to pay to demolish something that might be legally protected by a plan they didn't fully understand. I was going to find the infrastructure plan they kept invoking, the real one, the one filed somewhere beyond association binders. And once I had it, once I could hold the truth in my hands the way they held their threats, this wouldn't be a debate about compliance anymore. It would be a reckoning about who had the right to order demolition on land they didn't truly control. The order didn't cool off after that first visit. It accelerated, and by the next morning the Homeowner Association had turned a single clipboard confrontation into a full-scale offensive, starting with a second email flagged as time-sensitive that reiterated the demolition demand and added a deadline in bold, followed by a printed notice taped to the edge of my garage warning that failure to remove the drive would result in association-arranged corrective work. Language carefully chosen to imply they could send crews onto my property without consent, and what made it worse was the speed. The way everything arrived back-to-back as if they were trying to overwhelm me before I could breathe. Because pressure is most effective when it denies you time to verify facts. And that tactic became obvious when an enforcement truck rolled up mid-morning and parked across the street. The same man with the clipboard stepping out again, camera in hand this time, photographing my driveway from multiple angles like he was documenting a crime scene. And when I asked him directly whether the association had obtained any permit or municipal directive authorizing demolition, he didn't answer the question. He simply repeated that the board had adopted an infrastructure plan that superseded outdated conditions, a phrase that sounded rehearsed and hollow, and I noticed he avoided using the word city or county entirely, which mattered. Because real infrastructure plans don't exist in isolation. They involve agencies, timelines, public notices, and none of that had happened. Yet here was a private board acting like it could rewrite the physical layout of my property on its own authority. And as he photographed, a few more male neighbors drifted into view under the pretense of walking dogs or checking mail, the audience growing because public pressure is part of the enforcement strategy, and I could feel the narrative forming around me. The quiet suggestion that I was resisting something necessary, something for the good of the community, even though no one could explain what that necessity actually was. And when the enforcement officer finally left, he warned me that the board would be meeting soon to finalize next steps, which told me they weren't interested in clarification, they were interested in momentum, and sure enough, by late afternoon another email arrived outlining compliance options, each one worse than the last, suggesting I could voluntarily demolish the drive and apply for reimbursement later, or agree to redesign it according to association standards, or grant temporary construction access in preparation for future work, all framed as reasonable compromises while assuming their right to order demolition in the first place. And reading those options, I realized the association wasn't reacting to a problem, it was manufacturing one because no active project existed, no crews were scheduled. No utility company had contacted me, and yet they were already discussing future phases, as if inevitability could replace legality, and that realization pushed me deeper into the documents I'd pulled the night before. Because the more the association talked about an infrastructure plan, the clearer it became that they were either misunderstanding it completely or deliberately distorting it. And as I spread maps and plats across my table in full daylight, tracing lines with my finger, I saw how easy the mistake could be for someone skimming rather than reading, because the municipal plan referenced a drainage improvement corridor that ran near my lot. But it didn't require demolition, it didn't mandate removal. It specifically noted existing surface crossings were approved and to remain until such time as an actual project commenced, which meant my driveway wasn't an obstacle, it was an acknowledged feature, and that distinction was everything. Because if the association was invoking a plan without understanding its limitations, their entire enforcement action was built on a false premise, and false premises collapse the moment they're forced into the open. And that pressure came from an unexpected direction when another neighbor stopped by quietly, a man who'd lived there longer than most, telling me he'd overheard board members talking about setting an example and cleaning up non-conforming features. Phrases that had nothing to do with infrastructure and everything to do with control, and that confirmed my suspicion that the plan was just a pretext, a convenient excuse to force compliance and establish authority over older properties like mine that didn't fit their preferred image. And once that clicked, the escalation pattern made sense. The rushed deadlines, the public notices, the threats of demolition arranged by the association itself, all of it designed to make resistance feel futile. And that pressure peaked when I received a certified letter scheduling a formal compliance hearing, accusing me of refusing to remove an unapproved drive and interfering with planned infrastructure improvements. Charges written with such confidence they assumed the conclusion before the process even began, and the hearing date was set uncomfortably close, barely giving me time to respond, which again signaled urgency on their side, not mine, because organizations confident in their authority don't rush hearings. They slow them down, and standing there with that letter in my hands, I felt the stress sharpen into focus. Because this was no longer just about my driveway, it was about whether a private board could force demolition based on a misunderstood document without any actual project in place. And the more they escalated, the more dangerous their position became. Because if they ordered demolition without municipal backing, they weren't just wrong, they were exposed. And I decided then that the hearing wouldn't be a debate about aesthetics or compliance. It would be a confrontation with the actual infrastructure plan they kept invoking. But this time read in full, with the right people aware of what the association was attempting. And as the days leading up to the hearing ticked by, the pressure continued, enforcement reminders sent daily, a follow-up visit warning me that contractors could be authorized after the hearing. And even a notice posted on the community board describing the situation as a necessary corrective action, framing me as an obstacle to progress. And I watched it all unfold without reacting publicly, because reacting publicly would only feed the narrative they were trying to build. And instead I focused on assembling the one thing they couldn't spin, the complete infrastructure plan, not the summary they'd cherry-picked, but the full filing with annotations, approvals, and conditions. Because once that document entered the room, once its language was read aloud instead of paraphrased, the association's entire escalation would be forced to stand on its actual merits. And the irony was that every aggressive step they took made that reckoning inevitable, because the louder they shouted about demolition, the more attention they drew to a plan they clearly hadn't bothered to understand. And by the time the night before the hearing arrived, with my documents laid out and the association's notices stacked neatly beside them, I knew the conflict had reached its breaking point. Because either the board would admit it had overreached, or it would expose itself trying to justify demolition on the basis of a plan that never gave them that power in the first place. The crisis hit the moment the homeowner association stopped pretending this was a discussion and started acting like demolition was already inevitable. Because 3 days before the scheduled compliance hearing, I woke to the sound of engines outside and looked out to see a pair of marked contractor trucks parked along the curb, not working yet, just sitting there like a threat made visible. And taped to my front door was a fresh notice stamped, "Final Pre-Enforcement Inspection," stating that crews had been notified and that failure to self-correct would authorize association-directed removal of the drive immediately after the hearing. And that was when the full weight of what they were attempting finally settled in. Because this wasn't about future planning anymore, it was about forcing demolition through momentum and intimidation, creating the impression that the outcome was settled, so I'd either comply or be crushed by process. And as I stepped outside into bright daylight, one of the clipboard men approached again, this time flanked by another board representative, both speaking over each other about timelines and safety and progress as if my consent was irrelevant. And when I asked them directly what municipal department had ordered this removal, they dodged, saying the association was aligning ahead of anticipated infrastructure activity, a phrase so vague it bordered on meaningless. And when I pointed out that no permits were posted and no city notice had been issued, one of them snapped that permits weren't required for association corrective work, which was the exact moment I knew they'd crossed into dangerous territory. Because demolition without permits isn't enforcement, it's trespass and destruction, and I could see it in their faces that they hadn't thought that far ahead. They were relying on speed and fear to carry them through before anyone with real authority noticed. And the pressure intensified hour by hour as emails stacked up, reminders of fines, warnings about liens, suggestions that delaying would increase community costs, all designed to make me feel responsible for consequences they were manufacturing. And by midday, the association's attorney sent a letter asserting that my driveway interfered with a protected infrastructure corridor, and that the board had the authority to require removal in advance of planned improvements. A claim delivered with such confidence it might have worked on someone who hadn't read the actual plan, but I had, and the more they escalated, the clearer it became that they were misusing the word infrastructure as a shield. Because real infrastructure planning doesn't authorize private demolition orders without coordination. And that gap was what finally pushed me to involve people outside the association's bubble, starting with a call to the city's public works office, where I asked a simple question under my address about whether any approved infrastructure project required removal of my driveway, and the answer came back quickly and decisively. No project, no order, no authorization, and when I explained that a private association was threatening demolition anyway, The tone on the other end changed immediately because that moved the situation from internal dispute to potential unlawful action, and they asked me to email copies of the notices. Which I did, every threat, every demand, every claim about infrastructure, and that was the moment the balance shifted, because once a city department is looped in, private boards lose the ability to operate unchecked. And almost as if they sensed it, the association escalated again that afternoon by moving the hearing up by 48 hours. A clear attempt to outrun scrutiny, and the new notice accused me of obstructing planned improvements and refusing to cooperate with community safety measures, reframing my refusal to demolish my own drive as defiance. And standing there reading it, I felt the familiar surge of stress. Because being told you're the problem often carries weight even when you know it's false. But what steadied me was the infrastructure plan itself, the real one, the full filing with its diagrams, conditions, and annotations, because buried in its pages was the sentence the association had ignored completely, the one stating that existing access surfaces were approved to remain in place, and that removal would only occur if and when a project was funded, scheduled, and permitted by the city. Language so clear it didn't leave room for interpretation, and that meant the association's entire case rested on a future that didn't exist yet. And as the hearing approached, the pressure peaked with one final tactic. A notice slipped into my mailbox stating that contractors were on standby and that delays could increase costs assessed to my account. A thinly veiled attempt to scare me into backing down at the last moment. And I could feel the tension humming through the neighborhood, people watching, whispering. Unsure who was right, but certain something serious was unfolding. And that isolation was part of the design. Because if you feel alone, you're easier to push, but I wasn't alone anymore. Not with the documents I had and not with the city now aware of what the association was attempting. And the night before the hearing, I laid everything out again, the association's notices on one side, the infrastructure plan on the other, and the contrast was almost absurd. Because one side was full of urgency and threats and assumptions, and the other was calm, dated, stamped, and specific. And that calm specificity was exactly what the association feared, because it couldn't be shouted down or voted away. And by morning, when the sun rose clean and bright and I stepped out onto the same driveway they wanted demolished, I felt the crisis crystallize into something almost simple. Because this wasn't about whether the board believed it had authority. It was about whether it actually did, and once that question was asked in the right room, with the right documents and the right eyes on it, everything they had built this escalation on was going to collapse, and the only question left was how publicly it would happen, because boards that push demolition without permits don't just lose arguments, they expose themselves. And as I locked my door and headed to the hearing knowing crews were waiting on a decision they had no right to make, I understood this was the worst moment of the conflict. The point where the association had committed fully to a lie, and I was about to force it into the light under full daylight, where it could no longer survive. The turning point arrived in that bright municipal room where the Homeowner Association expected to finalize demolition and instead found its authority evaporating under daylight. Because the hearing opened exactly as planned on their side, the board seated in a neat line with binders stacked. The association attorney speaking confidently about infrastructure conflicts and future readiness, framing my driveway as an obstacle to progress. And I let him finish without interruption because confidence built on misread documents always sounds strongest right before it fails. And when it was my turn, I didn't argue inconvenience or fairness. I placed the infrastructure plan itself on the table, the full municipal filing, not the excerpt they'd been citing, and I watched the room lean forward as pages turned. Stamps appeared, dates older than the association itself quietly asserting their relevance. And I read aloud the clause they had ignored from the beginning, the one stating that existing surface access features were approved to remain unless, and until a funded, scheduled, and permitted city project required modification, language so precise it left no room for interpretation. And the shift was immediate, because suddenly the association's narrative had to confront the document it claimed to represent. And that confrontation deepened when I introduced the correspondence from Public Works confirming there was no active project, no permit, no directive requiring demolition. A confirmation that turned their infrastructure plan from justification into pretext, and I could see the board members exchanging looks as the association attorney flipped pages faster, searching for something that wasn't there, because plans don't grant authority just by existing, they grant conditions. And none of those conditions had been met. And when I stated calmly that ordering demolition without municipal authorization exposed the association to liability for unauthorized destruction of property, the tone of the room shifted completely, because that wasn't an argument, it was a consequence. And consequences don't care about board votes, and the chair attempted to steer the conversation back to association standards, but standards collapse when they contradict superior authority. And at that moment, the attorney asked for a recess, not to strategize how to win, but to stop the damage from spreading. And during that recess, he pulled me aside and asked directly whether I intended to escalate the matter with the city or pursue damages if demolition proceeded, a question that only appears when someone realizes they've crossed a line. And I told him my objective was simple, to keep my driveway intact and stop unauthorized enforcement, nothing more. which was enough to make clear that continued escalation would only make things worse for the association. And when the hearing reconvened, the posture had changed entirely, voices quieter, language cautious. The board acknowledging that the infrastructure plan did not in fact authorize immediate demolition, that enforcement actions would be suspended pending review, and that no contractors would be permitted on my property, statements that sounded procedural but amounted to surrender. And when I asked on the record whether the demolition order was withdrawn, there was a pause before the chair confirmed it was effective immediately, and that confirmation landed harder than any apology because it ended the conflict in one sentence. And by the time the meeting adjourned, the association's entire escalation had unraveled, not because I raised my voice or outmaneuvered them politically, but because I forced the plan they kept invoking to speak for itself. And documents that predate power structures have a way of doing that. And as I stepped back out into the sunlight and stood on the same driveway they had ordered destroyed days earlier, I felt the tension release not into celebration but into clarity, because this was the moment the crisis reversed, the exact point where assumption met evidence and lost. And I knew then that the final phase wouldn't be confrontation anymore. It would be cleanup, quiet retractions, revised language. And the slow process of an organization pretending it had never been wrong, because boards don't like to admit overreach, they just stop reaching, and that retreat was already underway. The resolution didn't explode outward, it folded inward, the way a bad decision collapses once it's exposed to light. Because after the hearing, the Homeowner Association moved with surprising speed to undo what it had so confidently ordered, starting that same afternoon with an email sent to the entire community stating that the demolition directive had been issued in error due to a misinterpretation of planning documents, language carefully sanitized to avoid blame while still reversing course. And within 24 hours, a second notice arrived directly to me confirming in writing that my driveway was fully compliant, permanently approved, and exempt from any future infrastructure-related enforcement unless mandated by the city itself. A sentence that mattered because it stripped the board of the power it had tried to invent, and the quiet retreat continued as enforcement notices were formally rescinded, fines nullified before they could exist. And the contractors who had been parked like threats were never seen again, their presence erased as quickly as it had appeared. And what struck me most was how fast certainty dissolved once the infrastructure plan was read correctly, because the same board members who had spoken in absolutes just days earlier now spoke in careful qualifiers, emphasizing cooperation and transparency, words that only appear when authority has been checked, and that shift didn't go unnoticed in the neighborhood. Because neighbors who had watched silently before now asked questions openly, wondering how a demolition order could be issued without permits, without city involvement, without even basic verification, and those questions lingered longer than any notice ever had, because they changed how people viewed the association itself, no longer as an unquestionable authority but as a group capable of serious overreach, and that reputational damage showed in the weeks that followed. A special board meeting announced and then abruptly canceled. A revision to enforcement procedures circulated requiring external verification for any action involving infrastructure or property alteration, and a quiet reshuffling of roles that removed the most aggressive voices from visible positions. All signs of an organization trying to stabilize after exposing itself. And for me, life returned to its ordinary rhythm under the same bright daylight that had framed the conflict from the beginning. My truck rolling down the same drive they had ordered destroyed, neighbors waving again without hesitation, the concrete unchanged and quietly defiant simply by existing. And the final confirmation arrived when a brief letter from the city's Public Works Department stated that no infrastructure project affecting my property was planned or approved, and that no private entity had authority to mandate demolition in its absence. A document I didn't need anymore but kept anyway, because conflicts like this leave behind lessons worth remembering, and standing there one morning rinsing pollen off my windshield just like before. I understood the real outcome wasn't just that my drive remained intact, it was that the association learned a boundary it couldn't cross again. Because once you try to order demolition without legal ground, every future action you take is viewed through that lens of doubt. And that doubt is powerful. It forces verification, slows aggression, and restores balance. And that balance was evident in the months that followed as enforcement notices grew rarer, language softened. And the association stuck carefully to matters it could actually control. And the entire episode settled into memory as a reminder that overreach often hides behind official words until someone forces those words to be measured against reality. And in this case, reality was a stamped infrastructure plan, clear conditions, and a simple truth the board had ignored, that plans don't grant power by being cited, they grant limits by being read. And once those limits were enforced, everything snapped back into place. The driveway remained, the threats vanished, and the assumption that a private board could order destruction of established property without consequence was corrected permanently, not through drama but through documentation, not through shouting but through clarity, and that was enough because justice in conflicts like this doesn't need spectacle, it needs precision, and under full daylight precision always wins.